Good morning again. Welcome to our first-time guests. It's so good to see your faces. I'm seeing some out-of-town faces, some folks we haven't seen in a minute, and I'm so glad that y'all took the time to come up to Brooklyn. It's so good. Looking forward to having a good time with each and every one of you later as we hang out in the tent. But I do have a word for today, and you know, my job is to listen. I don't have sometimes a direction of where I think I'm going, and as I begin the process of preparing, oftentimes I'm led in a direction that I did not expect. But I recognize, again, as my job is to listen, there is a collective asking, there's a collective conversation that's happening, and I simply tune into that frequency, tune into that broadcast, and so I know that this message is a message that's being called forth, and so I invite you to keep your ears, your hearts, and your minds open to what's being shared today. Now, we started last week with the message, Loving Jezebel. We went to the book of Kings, and we looked at that story of Jezebel to really change our perspective on who and what Jezebel is, recognizing that the whole idea of a Jezebel spirit and the ways in which women are victimized and vilified as a result of this story, it's a problem. And so I took us back to the story to really look at who Jezebel really was and recognize that it has nothing to do with a Jezebel spirit or the evil spirit or so-called loose women or all the mess that people try to espouse as the truth, using this woman as the source of that. And so I invite you to go back to that message if you haven't heard it, and if you need to be healed of those beliefs around the feminine. So today we're going to look at Joshua and the Battle of Jericho. Now, the thing about the Old Testament or the First Testament that we have to acknowledge is that the First Testament is filled with lots of war and lots of violence. It actually, war and violence really fills up the bulk, I would say, of the First Testament, and particularly when we come from the Moses story forward, right? Moses to Joshua to the Judges and the Kings. There's just nothing but war and violence. And the way that it's written about, it's written about in a way that's matter of fact. It's written about in a way that's sort of the natural outcome. This is how it should be. This is what was supposed to happen, because this violence is justified because this is what Yahweh or Jehovah commanded. So no one ever really questions that these wars were just. No one ever questions if this violence was something that should or should not have happened. And so I want to take us to the text. We're going to look at this story of Jericho, and then we're going to question the text a little bit. So I'm in Joshua 6, verse 1 through 5. Now Jericho was shut up inside and out because of the Israelites. No one came out and no one went in. The Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have handed Jericho over to you, along with its king and soldiers. You shall march around the city, all the warriors circling the city once. Thus you shall do for 6 days, with 7 priests bearing 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. On the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, the priests blowing the trumpets. When they make a long blast with the ram's horn, as soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then all of the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat, and all the people shall charge straight ahead." We know that, right? That's the essential story of Jericho, right? That Joshua was commanded by God and given this plan that they would walk around the city of Jericho, the walls of Jericho, with the 7 priests. They would do that for 6 days. On the 7th day, they would do that 7 times, and then blow their horns, the walls would fall. So we go forward to same chapter in verses 15 and 16. On the 7th day, they rose early at dawn, but they had already done the first 6 days, and marched around the city in the same manner 7 times. It was only on that day that they marched around the city 7 times. And at the 7th time, when the priests had blown the trumpets, Joshua said to the people, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city." So the people shouted, and the trumpets were blown. As soon as the people heard the sound of the trumpets, they raised a great shout, and the wall fell down flat. So the people charged straight ahead into the city and captured it. Then they devoted to destruction by the edge of the sword all in the city, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, and donkeys. So first and foremost, you hear that last line, right? You hear what happened? If you don't take anything else from this message, and we're going to talk about a whole lot, but can we just agree to stop using Jericho as a metaphor or inspiration for what God is doing in our life? When we read that line, they devoted to destruction by the edge of the sword, all in the city, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, and donkeys. The Battle of Jericho is a massacre. It should be called the massacre at Jericho. And unfortunately, because this text has been spiritualized over and over again, we have folks that are always preaching and teaching or affirming, that this is God has a battle plan for my life, and I may not understand it, or I'm facing my Jericho, or they teach us a story about persistence, right, and obedience. You may not understand what God is doing. God said walk for 6 days, and then on the 7th day, walk around 7 times. You may not understand God's plan, but keep going, have faith, be persistent, because the walls will come tumbling down. They devoted to destruction by the edge of the sword, all in the city, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, and donkeys. It was a massacre. For us to use the massacre at Jericho as a source of inspiration would be like us taking, it's called in this country, the Battle at Wounded Knee, again, another massacre, where innocent indigenous peoples were killed, men, women, and children, and we would say, God has given me my wounded knee. And I'm so grateful and thankful that now here in Congress, there's an act in Congress that is seeking to remove those medals that were given to soldiers. There were 20 medals of honor that were given in celebration of this massacre. Grateful that that's being taken away. I was thinking about another idea. You may know about Black Wall Street, Tulsa, Oklahoma. Yes. It would be the same thing as if we were saying, God has given me my Black Wall Street. Because that was a massacre of innocent people. There's nothing in the text that says anything about who Jericho was, who the people were. We're led to assume, and I talked about this last week, that the voice of the writers, it's the Deuteronomistic history. When we understand that the goal of the writers was, it had a nationalistic purpose. The purpose was to justify really the kingdom and the reign of Josiah. And so everything that's written in that story from Deuteronomy through 2 Kings is all a setup to lead us to supposedly believing that Josiah indeed was God's chosen. And so when we understand that, we have to question the text. We have to look at that. Another massacre that has taken place in this country, Rosewood. Yes. This is what Jericho was, y'all. This was not some beautiful spiritual thing that God was doing. So if you take nothing else from this, we must stop using Jericho as a metaphor or inspiration for what God is doing in our lives. And so, as I share this information and we question the text, of course, that all sounds good. And so we recognize that when we understand this violence, we can no longer find glory in this story because it was a massacre. But what's interesting is the violence in there. If you turn the page and you keep reading, you find that in the text it says, they took all the silver, gold, bronze, and iron because they were, quote unquote, sacred to the Lord. So not only was it violent, but they stole all the people's money. They killed all of their oxen and cattle, which was a sign of wealth, right? And then next, you turn the page, there's an ambush at Ai. They killed the king of Ai, and then the text says, and 12,000 men, women, and children. Massacre. But this is God's doing. We're supposed to find glory and joy in this text. And if that's not enough, you turn the page again, and then you find out they go to the Gibeonites. And I love this part of the story because, see, what was happening, because Joshua and his evil army in the name of the Lord were going around massacring and killing folk and taking over land that didn't belong to them. It's just like the way the United States moved west. You know that whole thing? Same story. The reason why there were these wars and violence in the text is because there were people that were already living in the so-called land that God was giving them. So they had to steal it. They had to fight. They had to kill in order to take it. In the same way that happened again in this country. Most of the West Coast should be Mexico. Right? And so you turn the page, and what happened, because the Gibeonites heard about what happened. They heard about what happened in Jericho. They heard about what happened in Ai with King Achan and how he was killed, and 12,000 men, women, and children. Oh, and they took gold and silver there too. That's a whole other story. But they just heard what was going on. So the Gibeonites said, okay, here's what we do, y'all. Let's act like we ain't got nothing. And so when they get here, we're just gonna be like, oh, Joshua, you all, we have nothing for you. We surrender to you, right? Last week, I talked about how if you read the 1st and 2nd Kings, it really reads like the Game of Thrones to me. right? And so you remember, if you're a Game of Thrones fan, you remember what happened as Daenerys started to move forward and she started to gather her army and gather more people. Eventually, she would get to a city where she would get there and they were already like, we're good, you got dragons, we are not trying to mess with you, right? So this is what was happening with the Gibeonites in this story. Right, they had heard what was going on. They heard that all these people are being killed. The numbers continue to change because we have different writers. So at some point, we hear that Joshua has 30,000 soldiers. Other times we read he has 5,000. The point was he had a whole bunch of people, according to the story, and they were just massacring folks. So the Gibeonites, they were smart. They were like, hey, we're not going to even pretend like we have anything. They hid all of their gold and all of their wealth and surrendered. Later, Joshua finds out that they lied. And his response is he makes them slaves. Now, why is that interesting? Do y'all know something about Joshua? When we first meet Joshua in the text, what is Joshua? He was a slave. Joshua was part of the original group, according to the story, that was with Moses and Aaron and all of them, Miriam and all of them. They crossed through the Red Sea. Yeah, they saw that miracle, right? All that stuff happened, wilderness, 40 years. And now he got the nerve to enslave somebody else? We have to question the text. We have to look at, this is what's happening. It makes absolutely no sense. But we understand that this is evil, what we're seeing here. This is injustice. This is abuse of power, is what we're seeing here. This is theft, is what we're seeing here. So then the question comes, is there any redeeming value in reading this text? Is there any reason to read these stories or memorize these stories or study these stories? And so the first thing I want to invite you to just take in, and I say this often, is that when we read the Bible, we must understand that we're looking at and working with myths, allegories, and stories that were designed to hide a deeper meaning or a deeper truth in plain sight. When I say myth, I'm not really talking about whether it's factual or not. As I shared last week, the purpose of these stories, Deuteronomy through 1st and 2nd Kings, was not to tell historical fact. And we can see that in the text, because in the text, the writer says, you know, as for everything else that the king did, is it not written in the annals of the book of Kings? So the writer was saying, there's a whole other book that will give you history and fact. That's not what I'm doing. I'm writing a nationalistic story to make you believe that our kingdom is the best kingdom, and to make you believe that Josiah is indeed God's chosen king. That was the purpose. So in the sense, we're not talking about whether this is history or fact, but we recognize that what the ancient stories were always doing, and we see this not just in the Bible, we see this all throughout the ancient Near East. This is what the writers and the storytellers did. They hid deep truths in plain sight in these stories. And so what we get then are the inner mysteries and the outer mysteries. The outer mysteries are the stories as we read them. The outer mysteries are the stories as we read, oh, Joshua did this, and God said to walk around the walls, and the walls came tumbling down, and then God said, go here and kill these people, and they did that. And then God said, go over here and steal their stuff, and they did, right? Those are the outer mysteries. And according to the Kabbalistic tradition, it's important that we read and understand this. This is why we have Sunday school, to understand these stories and get these stories in our minds, so that when we reach the age of maturity, which in the Kabbalistic tradition is the age of 40, we can then be revealed and taught the inner mysteries. And so the inner mystery is a threefold path that is always happening, and we find this path over and over and over again. It's the path of gnosis, it's the path of knowing, it's the path of enlightenment. It starts with purification, then death of the old self, and then finally realization of oneness or enlightenment. If you read the Joseph story, it takes you through those 3 stages. The Moses story takes you through those 3 stages. The Joshua story takes you through those 3 stages. Elijah and Elisha, those same 3 stages. And the Jesus story, the same 3 stages. Again, purification, death of the old self, realization of oneness or enlightenment. And what's interesting is that this threefold path is symbolized in the path of the sun. In fact, this is what the ancients did. See, the ancients used what they witnessed in the heavens and then personified those movements in stories and myths that, as it was told over and over again, these stories grew larger and larger. And so that's why sometimes you'll hear a story and there were 10 people, and then there were 1,000 people, and then there were 30,000 people. Because, and again, I shared this last week. I invite you to go to the sermon on What's in Your Bible, because I break down this history a little bit more. That there are 4 schools of writers that actually wrote the Old Testament. And so we're finding, and within those schools are multiple writers over many years, first recognizing that these stories were just told orally, and so they changed over time. But even once they were finally written down and codified, then the varying stories from the 4 different schools were mashed together, and sometimes that's why the biblical text can be confusing, right? Or sometimes it repeats itself, or sometimes it'll say they went to a certain city, and then the next line they're mentioning another city, but they're supposed to be in the same place. Those are the reasons why. And so we find this. One of the things I love, for me, I really became fascinated with this idea as a child when I saw the movie, the classic 80s movies, Clash of the Titans. And I became fascinated with the Greek stories. This was the story of Perseus, but all of the gods are there. And again, this is what the Greeks were doing. They were taking what they saw in the heavens. Perseus is a constellation. And they began to personify the movement of that constellation into stories. Every one of the gods are representative of planets, and every one of the planets, of course, we see their movement. And so they began to tell these stories as you're seeing the planets interact with the sun, or the sun moving in and out of certain planetary houses, or in and out of certain constellations. That became the stories. And so this ancient myth is retold over and over again. In the story of Osiris, it's told over and over again. In the story of Dionysus, it's told over and over again in the story of Mithras and Serapis. If you want to do even more study, I invite you to check out these 3 sermons: The Seed of Possibility, Now You've Crossed the Line, and The Captive, the Called, the Chosen. And so much of what I'm sharing is really building on what's been shared in those sermons. And so, again, I ask this question: is there any redeeming value? Like, why should we even read these stories? What could we possibly glean? How can we find some inspiration? How can we find some hope from these stories that are massacres? Well, again, as we understand that there's an inner and outer mystery, I want to talk about the inner mystery of this story and what was being hidden in plain sight. Now, it takes some study, and we have to understand something interesting about Judaism and about the Hebrew religion, or the Hebrew cult, as it was developed. One of the interesting things about the Hebrew cult is that it's considered a lunar cult. One of the things that we see and we read in the Bible, how there are all these different factions and different ways of believing and different ways of practicing, and whose God is better than the other God. And what was really happening on a certain level, you have those who were a lunar cult, right? And the moon was their heaviest influence. You had others that were a solar cult, and the sun was a heavier influence. This began, of course, becomes then the roots and the origins of Christianity. Because we recognize that as Christianity became the dominant religion in the Western world, the king was actually a sun worshiper. And so what began to happen, he merged the ideas of the sun with the story of Jesus so that he could unite his kingdom. And so this is why we have these ideas of Jesus being the bright and morning star, and that use of sun and son of man, it has to do with the S-U-N and S-O-N. And so understanding that the Hebrew cult is a lunar cult, it gives us some interesting ideas. Now, the evidence is present in the text, but it's also present in modern day practices. One of the things, if you watch and you see men who are Jewish, what do they wear on their heads? It's a kippah or a yarmulke, yes? That's a little moon. That's what that is, and that comes from the ancient time. But one of the other things that's interesting is Judaism is based on the lunar calendar. All of the holidays and the way things are witnessed and marked is based on the lunar calendar, not the Gregorian calendar. And what's interesting to me about this is that where this actually started, if we dig into the ancient roots of it, it's rooted in the principle of correspondence. As above, so below. As below, so above. And what that means is that whatever is true of the heavens must be true here on earth, and vice versa. And so what the ancients began to do, they began to witness something very interesting about the feminine. They recognized this 28-day-ish cycle that was happening. And they looked up in the sky and they said, the moon is doing that 20-day-ish cycle as well. And so they understood that there's something powerful going on in here. And so this is where and how and why the feminine became very important, and even sometimes why we see the push and pull between honoring the feminine and dishonoring the feminine, because what we're seeing is which cult is trying to take power, right? If you're a lunar cult, you have to put the feminine forward, right? But if you're a solar cult, which is the masculine, then you're going to start to put that forward. And so we're starting to see where that thing starts to happen. And so what's interesting about that, according to tradition within Judaism, each month, according to the lunar calendar, right, the new moon is the beginning of the month. And so according to tradition, women are honored. It's a time where women don't work, right, where they get to just be, many times just doing whatever it is that they want to do, sometimes going to the temple and praying. But it's a time to honor the feminine in that way. Now, we also understand something interesting. According to the lunar calendar, we have the 7-day week. And again, this is so important because this comes from Judaism, right? This is why we have the 7-day creation. It's based on the 7 planets. Yes, yes? We understand that, right? That's the reason we have the 7-day week. And we understand something interesting, that after 4 cycles of 7, what do we get? A month, 28 days. Month. It's the same root. And so again, we get this word because of the moon. We get this word because of the lunar calendar. And so if we recognize that, there's something even deeper that happens. Because the lunar calendar, unlike the Gregorian calendar, we know that every 4 years in February we add another day, right? We have 29 days. Well, in the lunar calendar, it works different. There's a 19-year cycle, and so they have leap years. And so in their leap years, there are actually 13 months instead of the what we consider normal, the 12 months. And so having the 13 months, then we understand that 13 is a sacred number. A number that's related to the feminine. It's a sacred number in the Hebrew tradition, because if we look at the lunar calendar, it has 364 days in that calendar. And if you divide 364 by 28, which is a month, you get 13 equal cycles. And so 13 is a sacred number. It's a holy number. It's a feminine number. And so given that information, let's go back to the text. The Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have handed Jericho over to you, along with its king and soldiers. You shall march around the city, all the warriors circling the city only once. Thus you shall do for 6 days, with 7 priests bearing 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. On the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, the priests blowing the trumpets." Now, what's interesting to me, when we look at the text, does anybody know what Jericho means? It means moon or its moon. That's what the word means. And so, as we read that, then we hear an understanding that this is an Astro-Theological text. Jericho meaning moon, and this text telling us something about circling around this thing. The 7 priests then would represent the 7 planetary bodies, and they're holding the 7 trumpets, which represent the 7 days. The sun, the moon, Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, and Saturn. And if you look at the number of times that they marched around, it says, "You shall march around the city, all the warriors circling only once for 6 days." And then on the 7th day, how many times do they march? 7 times, for a total of how many times?
13.
What did we just say about 13? And so this one little tidbit in the story contains the wisdom of the heavens. It contains the wisdom of the lunar calendar. And what the ancients were seeking to do by putting it and hiding it within the story, it was enabling us to remember, or enabling the Jewish people, the Hebrew people, to remember the rhythm and the cycles and what was important about the heavens and what was important to them. And so this is why these things are hidden in the stories. Now at the time, again, it was revealed. It wasn't given as a literal story to then allow people to simply believe the literal story. It was given to commit to memory, and then eventually the inner mystery would be revealed. Because what this then does, it creates this beautiful cycle. There's so many other clues in the text. If you go before this chapter, chapter 6, and you go to chapter 5, 1, we find that Joshua celebrates the Passover. And what's interesting about that tells us where we are in the story from a celestial point of view. Right? That's telling us that we're in the sign of Aries. And then additionally, we find that when Jericho is introduced, it says, when Joshua was next, or in Gilgal, Joshua was next to Jericho. Gilgal is another interesting word. And it's related to the same way that Galilee is used in the Second Testament or the New Testament. Because Gilgal means wheel or circle or to turn. And so that clue from the writers is showing us, okay, y'all, I'm talking about the zodiac now, which is a circle. Anytime you see Galilee, the same thing in the text. It's like, oh, wait, here's the circuit. Galilee means circuit. Here's the circle. I'm talking about, there's some astrological information here. And then it takes us into this story of the Battle of Jericho. And so again, understanding that and having that is where it's important. So why do I share this with you today? I'm almost done. Because the title of this message is The Power of Cycles and Seasons. The ancient Hebrew writers thought it fitting to codify and mythologize the great movement of the heavens and the planetary bodies, to personify them as people, places, battles, betrayals, and victories. The cycle of the moon was important to them. The cycle of the sun was important to them. And all of this is hidden in plain sight. It's even hidden in plain sight in our own world. Today is Sunday because it's a day that honors the energy and power of our biggest star in the sky. Tomorrow is Moon Day because it honors the power and energy of the moons. And what's interesting, when we move away from English, it becomes very clear, right? We understand Martes. If you speak Spanish, Mars Day. The power and energy of Mars, and we move on, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, and Saturn. That's hidden right in plain sight. Every time we utter the words Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, we are calling on the energy of those planets. We are acknowledging that there's some energy there, and it's interesting if you start to think about this, and this is where I'm talking about cycles and seasons, because I love, for instance, Friday is Venus Day. Do y'all know what Venus is? Y'all know what Venus represents? And so you have this beautiful opportunity to live in the vibration of love, recognizing that every week you get to reaffirm and be reminded that love is. And so when we tap into these power of cycles and seasons, again, looking at what's hidden in plain sight, one of my favorite things to look at, what's hidden in plain sight, is how we use time, how we mark time. We have the hour hand and we have the second hand. We have the hour and we have the minute. Yes? Hour represents the movement of the sun. Because that word hour is related to and comes from the word Horus, which was a recognition of the sun. Hour and minute. Min is, again, taking us back to moon. And so when we look at the hour hand moving and the minute hand moving, we're watching the sun and moon. We're watching this beautiful dance. And what I love about that, when we start to think about that, and this is something powerful to tap into, and I guarantee you won't look at a clock the same. Because there's something that's happening, there's a cycle that's always happening that we're unaware of, but many times we feel stuck. Because if we look at the hour hand, right, an hour technically takes a long time, right? An hour, we gotta go through a whole 60 minutes. But a minute takes how long? 60 seconds. A minute just moves, right? And it moves, and it moves. Because that's how the moon moves. Right? We go through an entire year. We go, according to our Gregorian calendar, we go through our entire solar year. It takes a while to go from January to December. But every 28 days, the moon is moving. Yes, yes? Every 28 days, there's a cycle. So what if you were in an experience in your life where you felt stuck? What if you were in an experience in your life where it felt like things were moving real slow? Because maybe you had your attention and your focus on the hour hand instead of the minute hand. Because if we understand that there's a cycle that's always moving, if we understand that there's a season that we're always moving in and out of, we have the power, capability, and possibility to focus on the season that's in alignment with what it is that we're trying to create. And so if you feel stuck, if you feel like things are moving slow, turn your attention to the moon. This is what the Jewish people were inviting us to do. To understand that there's this cycle, there's this movement that's happening, and there's a season that I get to choose in this moment. If I create my reality, if I can speak those things that are not as though they were and experience it as a manifestation in my life, if I can see it in my mind and then hold it in my hand, I have the power to focus. And so fittingly enough, this Friday is Friday the 13th. And never again will we look at 13 as unlucky. Never again will we look at 13 as evil. Never again will we look at 13 as something wrong, because we understand, oh, this is that cycle of the feminine. It gets even more beautiful because on the East Coast at 12:35 or 25 on the East Coast, It's the full moon. So essentially Friday night, we have the full moon. We have this energy that we've been talking about, right? That's codified right here in the Jericho story, in the Joshua story. The power of 13, the power of the full moon. And so as we understand the metaphysical principle of vibration, that nothing rests, that everything moves. Life is always vibrating. This is the truth. This is a physical principle as well. These chairs that you're sitting in appear to be solid, but if you had a microscope, you would see that the molecules, the elements that make it up are actually moving, because nothing is at rest. Everything moves, everything vibrates. And then we have the principle of rhythm, the metaphysical principle of rhythm, which says everything flows out and in, everything has its tides. All things rise and fall, the pendulum swing manifests in everything. The measure of the swing to the right is the measure of the swing to the left. Rhythm compensates. And so if we understand that there's always movement, there's always vibration, and there's always rhythm, then, as I said earlier, we get to choose the cycle and the season. If we get to recreate our reality, you know, sometimes we see somebody and we say they're marching to the beat of a different drum, right? And when I was thinking about rhythm, really teaches us the exact same concept that we see in the hour and the minute, but even in a deeper way, right? Because in rhythm, if you have a whole note, right, you just clap 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, right? And that's a movement, right? 1, 2. But then you can take that same thing and add the quarter notes, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. And there's movement, right? There's a different type of movement. But those quarter notes are within the whole note. But then what's in the quarter notes? The eighth notes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. And then you can add 16 notes. 1, 2. And so we recognize the sixth, the whole, the quarter, the eighth, the 16th. Again, all of those pulses exist at the same time within. You have the power to choose which rhythm you want to dance to. You have the power to choose which rhythm you want to focus on. You have the power to choose, are you going to focus on the rhythm of things don't work out for me? Or are you going to focus on the rhythm where things are always working out for me? Are you going to focus on the rhythm of the worst is yet to come or the best is yet to come? This is the power of cycles and seasons. In truth, as we understand, again, moving through the calendar year, January to December, but every 24-hour period actually reflects the same movement of the sun. We go in 2-hour increments, right? And I love to think about it. When we move from midnight to 11:59, we experience it, right? The sun rises and falls, right? On that faster level. And then we also see the sun rise and fall as it moves up into the northern hemisphere and goes back down into the southern hemisphere and back up again and down. The cycles are always happening. Which one do you want to focus on? Because if it's true, as above, so below, which it is, and then as within, so without, the same cycle that you see in the planets and in the heavens, it is always existing right within you. So again, you may have been focusing on that slow solar energy. Nothing wrong with the solar energy, I'm not saying that. But I recognize if you're feeling stuck, if you're feeling fixed, if it feels like things aren't moving at all, one, that's a lie. Everything moves, everything vibrates. You're just on a certain cycle. And so if that cycle does not feel good to you, then you have the opportunity to turn your mind and to turn your attention, to remind yourself, I'm not stuck. To remind yourself that you're not limited, to remind yourself that there is no lack, there is no limitation. You can remind yourself, as we look to this story, how the moon works. You can remind yourself of the power of 13. You can remind yourself of the power of the feminine that's exemplified, and knowing that you can create any experience that you desire. With that, I invite everybody to stand. The best is yet to come. And so we choose to align ourselves with that cycle. There are a whole lot of cycles out here. The current news cycle may be telling you something that you don't really want to align yourself with. The current news cycle about people that look like you might not want to align with that cycle. the current news cycle about what's possible, what the statistics say about this one or that one. You might not want to align with that cycle. But as we recognize that there are multiple cycles happening at the same time, we in consciousness choose to align with the cycle that is beneficial. We in consciousness choose to align with the cycle that is affirmative. We choose to align in consciousness with the cycle that says nothing but good can come from this. And so I invite us all to just take a deep breath in, and we release. We breathe in, and we breathe out. There's a cycle that we can bring our minds to. So many of us are holding our breath, but we can tap back into the cycle of breathing in and out easily and effortlessly. And so as I breathe in and breathe out, I recognize that I am breathing you in and out, Mother, Father, God. For I recognize you are in all, through all, and as all. Every molecule that I breathe into my body is a God molecule. Every molecule that I breathe out of my body is a God molecule. I recognize that you are everywhere present at all times, present in the rays of the sun that are filling the space, present in the sound and the sphere and the ethers upon which this sound actually travels on. I recognize that you are everywhere present at all times. And as I recognize that you are everywhere present, I recognize who and what you are, that you are love itself. I recognize that you are all wisdom, all knowledge, all power. And I recognize that you are constantly encountered. If I'm in the valley, you are there. If I'm in the heavens, you are there. If I'm at home, you are there. If I'm at work, you are there. If I'm on the subway, you are there. If I'm in the car, you are there. If I'm on a bus, you are there. I recognize that you are constantly encountered. Right here and right now, you are here. And as I recognize that you are here now and always here, not because of my invocation, but because that's just how you operate, I choose here and now to speak this word in faith. I am so grateful and thankful for the cycles and the seasons. I am so grateful and thankful for the ebb and the flow, for the rising and the falling, for the swing to the left and to the right. And I am so grateful and thankful to know that by the power of the law of neutralization, I have the power to raise my mind up in consciousness and choose. I'm so grateful and thankful that I have the opportunity to neutralize my mind, to neutralize my thoughts, and align with that which is beneficial, and align with that which is fruitful, and align with that which is kind, and align with that which is just, and align with that which is equal, and align with that is for the highest benefit of all. I forgive myself and I set myself free. For any time that I aligned with that which was against me, I forgive myself and I set myself free for the times that I aligned with limitation. I forgive myself and I set myself free for the times that I aligned myself with the world story about me. I forgive myself and I set myself free when I aligned myself with my old partner's story about me. I forgive myself and I set myself free for the story that I believed that I couldn't have a child at the age that I was supposed to have a child, or can have a child later. I forgive myself and I set myself free for the words that I believe, for the diagnoses that I believe, for the limitations that I believe. I forgive myself and I set myself free right here and right now. In consciousness, I move myself to a new cycle. In consciousness, I align myself with a new season. In consciousness, I place myself into the season, just as the scripture says, being a tree planted by the rivers of water, knowing that I will yield fruit in and out of season. I align myself with that right now. I align myself with the fruitful life. I align myself with the beneficial life. I align myself with the protected life. I align myself with the nurtured life. I align myself with the healed life. I align myself with the harmonious life. I align myself with the prosperous life. I align myself with the God life. For all of these things are simply attributes of you. And as I recognize the absolute truth that we are not responding to you, but you are responding to us, I get really clear about where my vibration is. I get really clear about what it is that I'm expecting. I get very clear about the cycle that I am choosing to live on and operate on. And I know that with ease and effortlessness, you always respond to the cycle that I choose to be on. I know with ease and effortlessness, When I declare and decree that this is my season of harvest, so it is. I know that when I declare and decree that I am abundant always, at all times, in all things, so it is. I know that when I declare I am healed right now, so it is. I know that when I declare and decree that my relationships are healed, it is. I know that as I declare I am safe right here and right now, it is. I know that as I declare I have everything I need and more, it is. I know that as I declare right here and right now that I am protected and provided for, it is. I know that as I declare and decree right now that every good idea comes to me easily and effortlessly, so that I may be great on this planet, so that I may be fruitful on this planet, so that I may multiply my thoughts and my minds and be a beneficial presence on this planet. It is. So it is with joy. It is with thanksgiving. It is with gratitude. It is with full expectation and confidence, knowing that my word is that I release this prayer right here and right now into the mind that created all things, into the mind that says yes and only yes. And so we lift up our voices and we say amen. It is so. Ashe. It definitely will be so. And so it is. So it is. Thank you, God.